So, the singularity of God, implicit in monotheism. I'll borrow from the Shahada, and yes, I know my accent is atrocious. And start us off with the proposition, there is only one God. When we pick that proposition apart, we see that quite a lot is actually being said. It's very different to say there is one God than there is to say one apple. There is one apple. When I'm saying there is one apple, one of the ways that we may conceptually approach that proposition is to say that this is one iteration of a category of existence and experience that we generally refer to with the word apple. And that you can correctly infer prior experience with apples and transfer them over to this example of apple. We may go about it more organically and say that this that I am referring to with the word apple is a thing which you may sensorily interact with on your own, infer prior experience, so on and so forth. But note that all of these imply this is one example of a thing of which there are quite a bit more than one. And because there are quite a bit more than one of these things that I am referring to, you have likely, possibly, some prior experience with, and will have subsequent experience with. As such, experience leading up to this point may be applicable to a description of this thing. Experience of this thing may be applicable to future descriptions. That doesn't apply here. That doesn't apply here, and that's where we start running into trouble. Because we said there is one God. There's only one in this category. There is only one thing of which, or from which, or to which, our experience of this thing applies. Our knowledge of this oneness only applies to the one thing that we are describing, and only knowledge gleaned from this one thing may be applicable to its description. This kind of leads us into the foundational arguments for the position of Ignosticism. But I'll get there in a moment. Let's take on this idea of the singularity of God and try to break it down into a categorical description. There is only one God. Well, there is only one entry into this category. The bounds of the category and the bounds of iteration are perfectly congruent. There is nowhere to which the category extends that this specific instance of the category does not, and vice versa. There are no ways in which this iteration of the category of God is an exception or a deviation from the categorical traits. We might say, for example, we might say that apples are generally sweet. We have an apple that is not sweet, and we say that it is deviated from our categorical expectations. That can't happen here. That can't happen here, because the category is entirely defined by the example. Where this leads us pretty quickly is description via negativa. We can say a lot more about what this God is not than what this God is, or that appears to be the case. Let's say that we approach this via less by category and more by trait, by attribute. There is only one God. Or rather, let's go about this a little more formally. God is singular. The attributes of God are singular. Next iteration, or next iteration of process, the arrangement of the attributes of God, which are singular, are also singular. The correlative possibilities between the attributes of God and the attributes of not God, anything other than God, are also singular. The ways in which we would correspond or correlate observations of God to observations of anything else would also necessarily be singular by virtue of inheritance of trait from the attributes of God. To put this another way, if God had a color, it would be a color that existed nowhere else. It would be a color that functioned as a color unlike any other color. It would be a color whose combinatorial possibilities with other colors were unlike the combinatorial possibilities of any other colors. It would be a color that would be very, very difficult to correlate to any other color. It would be very difficult to say, to describe the way that this God color would interact with red, or green, or white, or black, absence of or totality of color. It would be difficult to describe its saturation point. It would be difficult to describe where it existed on the electromagnetic, where it existed on the visible light spectrum, because it is categorically unlike any other color. It's not a quantifiable deviation, it's a qualitative deviation. And because that, saying where it fits or how it connects to anything else is very, very difficult. And this is, again, this leads into the foundational argument for the position of agnosticism, the gist of which is that whether or not there is a God, any knowledge of this God would be, according to all known, formalized or informal standards of coherence of knowledge claim, would be incoherent. It is, in this position, anything that could be known about God would be known in a way so unlike any other knowledge that we couldn't quite call it knowledge. Or we wouldn't be able to correlate that knowledge to anything else. To take this from another angle, to be able to say that there is a God is one thing. To be able to say that there is a God, and so fill in the blank, is something else entirely. In the agnostic position, not agnostic, ignostic, saying that there is a God isn't really a problem. Saying that that knowledge necessarily interacts with or informs any other knowledge whatsoever, that's a problem. And, again, under this position, ultimately an irresolvable one. The beauty is, and this is why I said earlier, that we're in a somewhat unique position in our philosophical history for tackling this question, that language doesn't always work the way that we just described. Knowledge doesn't always work the way that we just described. In point of fact, it very rarely does. And so, I'll be getting to that in a little bit. But the really interesting thing about agnosticism, as a philosophical premise and as an illustration of the problem of this notion of a singular God, is not the claims that it makes or the claims that it refutes, but how its own mechanics actually break down under a little bit of analysis. And I'm sorry guys, we're going to be going straight philosophy of language from here on out. But I think it leads us somewhere interesting.